The first time my sister Melissa suggested I should help pay her rent, I genuinely thought she was venting. People complain about money all the time. Rent climbs, groceries get expensive, kids outgrow clothes with an almost aggressive efficiency, and I had learned over the years to treat most of what Melissa said about finances as ambient noise rather than a specific request directed at me. If someone had told me that afternoon that the same conversation would eventually tear apart my relationship with half my family, I probably would have laughed, not because it sounded impossible, but because it would have required believing a request that small could accumulate into something that large. The conversation started at a family barbecue in late June, the kind of humid afternoon where everybody pretends they're enjoying the heat while quietly migrating towards shade. Melissa arrived 20 minutes late with her 3 kids and enough bags, coolers, snacks, jackets, and assorted emergency supplies to suggest she was relocating rather than attending lunch. That was Melissa in miniature. Everything in her life operated at maximum urgency. Every minor inconvenience became a crisis, and the crises were always happening to her rather than because of her. That distinction had always mattered more than most people in my family were willing to admit, because people handle responsibility very differently depending on which side of that line they live. By mid-afternoon, with plates emptied and conversations drifting, someone mentioned housing costs, and the table took the bait collectively, the way it always did. Melissa sighed dramatically and pushed her plate aside. Her landlord had raised the rent again. The number she named was significant, not catastrophic, but enough to genuinely hurt on a single income with 3 kids. I felt bad. That part was real. The problem wasn't the sympathy. The problem was what sympathy quietly turned into once it was offered without conditions. About 2 weeks later, she called me while Claire and I were driving home from work. The second I saw her name, I assumed it was about one of the kids, a school issue, a birthday invitation, something routine, but instead she asked if she could run something by me, which should have been a warning. Every bad idea in my family begins with those exact words. She explained that she'd been looking at her budget and didn't think she could keep doing it alone, and when I asked what she meant, she said simply, "The rent." I pulled into a parking lot and cut the engine while she walked through the situation. The increase, the kids, the groceries, the school expenses, all of it true, all of it real, arranged into a picture that ended with the conclusion that I should help. The most effective manipulation rarely starts with lies. It starts with facts, then builds toward conclusions that don't belong there. She asked for a few $100s, just until she got caught up, and I agreed. Without much hesitation, without much discussion, because that is what you do when you believe you are solving a temporary problem for someone you love. I transferred the money that evening. Melissa sounded relieved, even emotional. Life moved forward. Then a month later, she called again. The situation hadn't resolved. The landlord wasn't flexible. Could I help one more time? Just one more. I agreed. Then a third month, and a fourth, and somewhere during the 5th, Claire sat across from me at our kitchen table and asked the question I had been successfully avoiding asking myself. Did I know when this was going to end? Claire closed her laptop and said exactly what she had been patient enough not to say for weeks. The first time sounded temporary. The second time sounded temporary. The 5th time, she said quietly, doesn't sound temporary anymore. The kitchen felt smaller than it had a moment before, because she was right, and we both knew it. There was no plan. There was no timeline, no target, no defined finish line. Only continuation, and continuation has a way of becoming permanent when nobody challenges it. What had started as a bridge was beginning to look more like a foundation. A few days after that conversation, at a family dinner, my mother asked whether Melissa was doing better now. The phrasing caught me immediately. Not what she asked, but the assumption buried inside it. The already knowing quality of a question asked by someone who has been given more information than you realized. Melissa looked across the table at me and said simply, "He's helping." The room softened in a way that told me everything. Mom smiled. Dad nodded. Relatives relaxed. And in that moment, I understood something uncomfortable. Nobody in that room saw my help as temporary anymore. They had reclassified it as a solution. And solutions, once accepted, have a habit of becoming obligations if you are not careful about naming the difference. Over the months that followed, the transfers continued with a steadiness that made them feel less like assistance and more like a standing bill. Nobody said that out loud. That was part of what made it so difficult to name while it was happening. The language around it stayed soft and grateful and familial, while the reality underneath hardened into something else. Melissa thanked me every month. My family praised me quietly, and that combination of gratitude and approval was just enough to disguise the fact that nothing was changing. No urgency to find solutions. No movement toward a plan. The pressure had migrated from her life into mine, and everyone had tacitly agreed to leave it there. Claire was the first one to say anything directly. She's an accountant. She notices patterns the way electricians notice bad wiring, not as a personality trait, but as a professional reflex. One afternoon in October, she walked out to the garage where I was working and showed me her phone without saying anything. Melissa, at a weekend resort. Pool, cocktails, matching shirts, the unambiguous evidence of a trip taken for pleasure. Nothing extravagant. I want to be careful about that. Just the ordinary kind of getaway that people take when they need a break. 3 days earlier, Melissa had called me in tears about rent. Claire asked if she was being unfair, and the fact that she asked that first. Not me. Not whether Melissa was being unfair, but whether her own reaction was, told me everything about the kind of person I had married. I handed the phone back and said I didn't know, which was a lie. I knew. I just wasn't ready for what knowing required. By Christmas, the transfers had become so routine that Melissa barely seemed uncomfortable asking anymore. The early requests had come with apologies, explanations, promises about timelines. The newer ones arrived with a confidence that implied the answer had already been determined before the question was asked. There's a particular kind of entitlement that grows slowly inside long-running generosity. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly replaces gratitude with expectation until one day you notice that the person receiving help has stopped wondering whether it will continue and started planning around the assumption that it will. At a family dinner after Christmas, the conversation drifted toward children, as it often did when our extended family gathered. Claire and I had spent years trying to have a family, doctors, tests, specialists, hope and disappointment, and more disappointment. The kind of sustained private grief that you eventually stop narrating to other people because repeating pain doesn't make it easier to carry. Most of our relatives knew. Melissa knew. My parents knew. Everybody knew, which becomes important in ways I didn't fully understand until later, because information held by the wrong people in the wrong context stops being a shared confidence and starts being a resource. Halfway through dinner, Melissa was talking about expenses, school costs, winter clothes, sports fees, the usual list, and my mother sighed and said she didn't know how parents managed anymore. Several relatives agreed. Then Melissa laughed, not a mean laugh, just a careless one, and looked directly at Claire and me and said, "You guys wouldn't understand." The table went quiet for a second. Claire smiled with the polite expression she reserves for things that have hurt her. Melissa continued, "Kids change everything financially." Nobody answered. Dad looked uncomfortable. My mother became very interested in her wine glass, and I sat with the particular feeling of watching someone say something they believe is merely true and not understanding how it registers on the person receiving it. The actual breaking point came during a phone call a few weeks later, a routine rent conversation that was going exactly as expected until the very end, when Melissa said something that made me stop mid-sentence. "I mean, you have more flexibility than I do." I asked what she meant. She said, "You know." I said, "No, I don't," which was both true and a test. After a pause, she said it plainly. "You only have to take care of yourselves." The sentence sat there, heavier than it had any right to be, because underneath the clinical language of flexibility and financial responsibility was an assumption she had apparently been carrying for some time, that our childlessness had made us liquid, that the life we hadn't been able to build had left a surplus available for redistribution, that the years of treatments and failures and grief were not our loss, but everyone else's opportunity. That night, Claire and I sat in the living room long after the television stopped holding either of our attention, and when I finally told her what Melissa had said, she listened quietly and then looked out the window for a long moment before she spoke. When she did, her voice had the particular calm that only appears after someone has been hurt enough times that the hurt itself becomes familiar. She said, "Your family treats our pain like spare income." The room went still because neither of us needed to explain what she meant. Every failed treatment, every specialist visit, every piece of hope that hadn't survived the year, somehow all of it had been quietly translated, in Melissa's accounting at least, into available budget. The cruelty of it wasn't that she said it. The cruelty was that she apparently believed it. I wish I could say I acted immediately. I didn't. Part of me hoped I had misunderstood, that the sentence was clumsier than it was calculated, that the most charitable interpretation was also the correct one. But the alternative, if Claire was right, meant that this had never been about rent at all. It meant that people who knew exactly what we had been through had looked at the family we couldn't have and identified it as an available resource. Once that possibility entered my thinking, I couldn't find a way to remove it, and I started noticing things in the months that followed that I had been successfully ignoring. By February, I had been helping with Melissa's rent for 8 months, a number that kept presenting itself as evidence, because temporary problems don't require 8 months of external funding without producing any kind of plan. The family language around it had shifted so gradually that it had become almost invisible. The conversation had moved from Ethan is helping to Ethan is handling it, and those are different things in ways that matter. My mother called one Saturday, and after the usual preliminaries mentioned Melissa's situation and sighed and said she didn't know what Melissa would do without me. No plan was discussed. No recovery was outlined. The assumption had simply settled into the structure of how things were, and nobody seemed to find that remarkable. The breaking point arrived at Easter. Large gathering, relatives filling the backyard, the chaotic warmth of a holiday that still felt like family, even though I was beginning to understand that family meant different things to different people in that yard. At some point, a cousin mentioned how expensive life had become. The table agreed. Someone joked about wishing they had financial help, and Melissa laughed and said, "You should try having 3 kids." A few people laughed politely. Then she added that some people didn't realize how expensive children were, and her eyes landed on me and then on Claire, and the table went quiet with the specific quality of silence that follows when everyone understands that what was just said wasn't accidental. I looked at my plate and considered ignoring it the way I had ignored dozens of smaller comments over the years. Then Melissa kept talking. She said we had more freedom, that we didn't have the same responsibilities, and then she arrived at the sentence I still remember word for word, years later. "You can afford to help because you don't have children." Absolute silence. The kind that physically changes a room. My mother didn't stop her. My father said nothing. Nobody did. And something in me that had been under pressure for 8 months finally gave way. Not explosively, not dramatically, but quietly and completely. The way something breaks when it has simply been under too much weight for too long. Because everybody at that table knew. They knew about the doctors and the tests and the specialists and the years and the grief that Claire and I had been living with in the particular privacy of people who have stopped expecting others to hold it with them. They knew, and not one of them said a word. The years of our private loss were apparently acceptable currency in an argument about rent. I looked at Melissa and asked, without raising my voice, "Do you really believe that? Do you really believe I should pay your rent because Claire and I couldn't have children?" The room froze. A cousin looked down. Dad shifted. My mother studied her plate. Melissa crossed her arms and said that wasn't what she said. I told her to tell me what she said. Then, and nobody answered because everybody had heard it, and there was no version of the words that meant something else. She tried the word flexibility again, the polite form, the socially acceptable container for what she actually meant. I told her I had been paying part of her rent for almost a year without complaint and without embarrassing her, but that we needed to stop pretending this was temporary. Then I said the thing I had been circling for months. Next month is the last payment. The silence that followed was the loudest the room had been all evening, because for the first time since the conversation started, everyone understood that this was real. Melissa said she couldn't believe I was doing this. My mother deployed the guilt she had been holding in reserve. "Ethan, think about the children." I told her I had been thinking about the children for 8 months, that I had thought about them every time I sent money and every time Melissa called, but that nobody in this room seemed particularly interested in thinking about me and Claire. That landed. I could see it in the faces around the table, not agreement exactly, but recognition, the involuntary acknowledgement of something true that people had been too comfortable to say themselves. My father, who almost never spoke during family conflicts, looked up from his plate and said 2 sentences that ended the argument more completely than anything else that evening. "Melissa, you should have made a plan. You knew this wasn't forever." He said it twice. Nobody argued with him. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the second time landed harder than the first, and everyone understood that what he was describing was simply true. The rest of dinner dissolved quietly. No dramatic departures, no thrown dishes, just people gradually stopping the performance of pretending everything was fine. Melissa left early. Mom followed shortly after. The relatives dispersed. By 10 o'clock, Claire and I were sitting in our living room in the kind of silence that follows something that has been a long time coming. She leaned against my shoulder and asked how I felt. I thought about it. Angry and relieved and sad and disappointed. All of it simultaneously and none of it quite accurately. And eventually said, lighter. It was the most honest answer I had. The backlash arrived the next morning and ran for almost 6 weeks. Calls, texts, voicemails, family messages cycling through guilt and logic and obligation and religion. Every argument built around the same foundation, the children. Nobody wanted to discuss responsibility or planning or the fact that 8 months of help had produced no solutions. The argument was always about what would happen to the kids, which is an effective argument because it sounds unanswerable. What surprised me was that I found answers anyway. Then something happened that I had not expected. Melissa stopped asking for rent money. Not because she accepted my decision or underwent some profound change of perspective, but because she found solutions, a cheaper apartment, a second job, adjustments to her spending, the kinds of practical steps that had apparently been available the entire time, but were considerably less attractive while someone else was covering the difference. That discovery was more infuriating than almost anything that had come before it, because it confirmed what part of me had suspected for months. The crisis had never been unsolvable. It was simply easier to solve with my money than with her effort, and as long as my money was available, the effort was never going to be made. Around that same time, Claire said something while we were reviewing our finances one evening that I have thought about many times since. She looked at the numbers and then at me and said, "You know what hurts most? It wasn't the money." Then she said, "It was watching people use the worst thing that ever happened to us as a financial argument." The room went still, because that was the wound underneath everything else. Not the rent, not the conflict, not the months of transfers or the Easter confrontation or the weeks of family pressure afterward. The wound was the assumption that because we never got the family we had hoped for, our resources belonged to everyone who had gotten theirs. 3 months after Easter, Melissa called asking for money again. School expenses this time. A different reason with the same architecture. I said no. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. She called me selfish and then cruel and then disconnected. Something I had been waiting months to notice finally arrived. I didn't feel guilty. Not even slightly. Because guilt only operates when you have actually done something wrong. And I had come to understand, slowly and then all at once, that refusing to become someone's permanent financial solution is not cruelty. It is the baseline condition of a functioning adult life. The official no-contact decision came 6 months after Easter. My mother kept pushing, Melissa kept circling back with variations on the same request, and the arguments never changed in substance, only in phrasing. Eventually, Claire and I left the family group chats, stopped answering the calls, stopped attending the gatherings. The silence that followed felt strange at first, then peaceful, then simply necessary. The particular quiet that arrives when you stop waiting for a conversation to happen differently than it always has. The last thing Melissa said to me came through a voicemail. She accused me of abandoning my family. I listened once and then deleted it, not from hatred and not from indifference, but because I was done defending myself against a debt I had never actually owed. It has been 3 years. I hear updates occasionally through relatives on the periphery of the situation. Melissa is fine. The children are fine. My mother remains angry in the sustained way of someone who has decided that anger is preferable to accountability. My father and I speak sometimes, quietly, separately from the rest, in the way of two people who arrived at similar conclusions from very different positions. Life moved forward for everyone, which is probably the detail that surprised the people most invested in convincing me that my refusal would be catastrophic. The world kept turning. The bills got paid. Problems got solved. Just not with my money. Looking back, the cruelest part of the entire situation was never the original request. People ask for help with rent. That is not a moral failing. It is an ordinary human need. The cruelest part was the moment I understood what my sister had been thinking, that she had looked at the family Claire and I had spent years trying and failing to build, and had seen in our loss not grief but availability. Not the absence of something we had desperately wanted, but the presence of something she could use. That was the moment the relationship actually ended. The rent was just the mechanism that made it visible.